The room was full of people. All around was a chorus of emotions, from smiling to cheering to crying and panting. Two figures sat outside the room, impatiently waiting for their turn. As the verdict was read, the faces of the impatient figures turned red with anger. The rest of the people in the room laughed at the spectacle. Daniela went to her own church while her grandmother went to another. Even so, Daniela was happy to help her in any way she could, helping with cooking for her church or even helping organize events. Her grandmother always looked at her granddaughter lovingly and only treated her with kindness. But not everyone saw it that way. Two people in particular took advantage of their ways. Grandmother Edith was a devout worshiper and had been in the same church for nearly 50 years. It was an evangelical church in a suburb in the Bible Belt of the South. Edith spent a few hours making sure she did her part for her church. She spent every Sunday in kindergarten, cooking breakfast and dinner, organizing events, and teaching youth Bible studies on Sunday evenings. Edith also donated a small portion of her pension to the church once a month. She was a very generous person and wanted to help in any way possible. Daniela can even remember Edith returning from a retreat to the city to get evangelical equipment that her pastor had forgotten. She didn't return to the retreat until the next morning and didn't even get a thank you. That was something that annoyed Daniela very much. Little did Pastor McConnell's advisor, Pastor James, know that Edith was reassuring him every step of the way. Daniela could tell that Edith didn't really care. She was always positive and told her granddaughter that her generosity would be repaid by Jesus. After an accident, Edith left with a broken back. All she could do was lie in bed. Many health problems began to appear at her age. Daniela could only watch while Edith became more and more withdrawn. Edith had been tied to the inside of her house for 10 years now. She hadn't gone to her local church in a long time, but she still tried hard to reach out to and talk to people. But Daniela saw her offers to get in touch were rudely turned down. Although Edith's body was slowly deteriorating, her mind was still as strong as ever since she had never drank alcohol and always exercised him. Her family tried to stay as close to her as possible, but they could see that she was really sad that she couldn't attend the service. When Edith went to the hospice, she could feel that her life was almost over. She wanted to organize her own memorial service, which she was adamant about, but then the pastor showed his true side. Daniela clenched her hand in a fist when her pastor James said he couldn't help her and preferred to send someone under after he kept her waiting for 3 days. Pastor McConnell was the one who stopped by and was obviously not her first choice from previous experiences with him. He raced over the courtesy and got straight to what she wanted at her service. Then he brought up a subject with a glimmer in his eyes. There has been a lot of speculation about how much money Edith had saved in her life. The church was apparently heard of this as well. What Pastor McConnell said next made Daniela tremble with rage before her grandfather stepped in anger in his eyes. Lay your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Edith's husband told him it was inappropriate to discuss things like money at a time like this. The pastor took a step back and considered, then approached Edith and talked about them. But he was slowly pushing the subject of money back into their conversation. It was obvious that he was really interested. What happened next made Daniela shiver. Your grandma was crying. Over the years, her family had realized that she was not a steel magnolia, but diamond-coated titanium wrapped in Kevlar. She would shed tears for others, but never for herself. Now this frail woman was roaring her eyes. The grandfather, a former Marine sergeant and a veteran of the Korean War, forcibly removed the pastor. But it would be 6 months before they saw the final results of the interview and Edith's spectacular repayment. The family was broken when Grandma Edith finally died, but the funeral was full of happy stories and lots of laughter. The pastors were not invited on request. However, they were asked to come to read the will. They were placed in front of the room in front of the whole family, but Grandma still had a few surprises up her sleeve. Reading the will had become a tradition in Danielle's family. It was an excuse for everyone to get together, a kind of family gathering. It took place in a conference room at a law firm that was filled to the rafters with aunts, uncles, great-uncles, and many grandchildren, and the two pastors, who were given special seats across from the room. The air was full of excitement. You see, there were rumors that there would be some surprises. The will was read, and it was clear that her grandmother's generosity extended well beyond her death. Everyone received memorabilia and significant monetary gifts. Finally, it came to church, and the pastors were already looking for their share of the property. The lawyer pulled out a letter that Grandma Edith had written just for her. In the last 10 years, not one person has called visited, or texted me to let me know they looked after me. Not a single pastor, not a deacon, not one of the churchwomen, not a member of the church, with whom I have worked all these years, whom I loved very much and considered my friends, read Grandma Edith's letter. I worked very hard for you when you needed me for many, many years. But when I needed you and your church, you all pretended I didn't exist. Daniela stood near her back, trying to contain her giggles. The letter exposed the pastor's greed and bad behavior. She described how they had only shown interest one last time to try to take their money. I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time, continued Edith's letter. Next came the first repayment blow. Pastor McConnell didn't know when he came to see me, but Grandpa and I had prepared my will long before he came, which included a double tithe, 20%, of my entire estate for my former church today, the lawyer continued. But I had a bad feeling that we hadn't personally remembered such nice people as Pastor James and Pastor McConnell, so I changed my mind to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money I left with the church. I have included money to reflect the love they have, and the church has not given me anything in the past 10 years, the letter continued. Both pastors and the church received 1 cent each. The pastors, sitting conspicuously in front of the whole family, looked like someone had injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaw, said Daniela. The family tried to contain their smiles, but there was yet another strike. Grandma Edith wasn't finished yet. There is one final legacy, the attorney continued, pausing to create a dramatic effect. Every eye in the room was now on the 2 pastors, who were trying to calm down after the brutal comeuppance that Grandma Edith had just served from the grave. Daniela and her family suppressed their laughter, but only because they knew that Grandma Edith was simply preparing the greedy pastors for a double blow. Daniela had almost fallen from her chair when she heard how much her grandmother was going to leave the church, emphasis on was. Instead, she listened in awe as the lawyer named another ward. It was a competing church with a larger population of African Americans. Then the pastor's eyes widened and their faces changed from a look of disbelief to pure horror. But why? It had slipped a few times that the pastors, despite being tolerant of sermons, were exactly the opposite. Their herd remained predominantly Caucasian for very questionable reasons. Grandma Edith and Grandpa had fought against it for years and even considered leaving their church because of it. But they had argued that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance through their words and example. In the end, Edith held out one last lesson, in which the whole family nodded in agreement. Their faces showed the same look of shock, fear, and horror they would have if the attorney had said, "This legacy goes to the demonic baby eaters for the purchase of extra-large rotisserie grills and tons of charcoal," wrote Danielle in a post on Reddit. For many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally offensive things one could do to them. At the same time they were labeled as racists, their bigotry condemned, and their delusions of white supremacy put down, explained Daniela. The amount was exactly the same as what the pastors would have received, if only they had shown kindness. The old couple had secretly given their donations to the place they deserved the most. The pastors quickly left the room, and Edith's strength would remain a story the family would tell for years. Of course, Daniela's story exploded on Reddit's Poor Revenge thread. The post has received over 1,600 comments so far. However, one user had an interesting question to ask. How did the pastors react after that? Daniela replied, "We had all swallowed our roaring laughter since the 1 cent estates had been read. The whole meeting quickly turned into complete chaos. If I remember correctly, the pastors walked away angrily, which was made weird because they had to push over a dozen of Grandma's heirs between and the only door in the room who now knew what scraps they were. If I remember correctly, I heard through the family's grapevine that a lawyer representing the pastors in the church called my uncle and threatened to deny the will," added Daniela. My uncle replied, "If you do, everything that happened in this meeting will become public knowledge. Are you sure you want this in the local newspapers and on TV? This is the last my uncle ever heard from you."